All right, everybody. Well, welcome back to our first session post Christmas, post New Year's. Happy New Year, Merry Christmas to you all. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday season. Bit of a different tenor on it this year, that's for sure, as we had to make do without the usual trappings. I think for some people that made this season quite a bit more enjoyable and a lot less stressful, and for others, of course, made it a whole heck of a lot less enjoyable. So I don't know. Do you call that a clean sweep all around? Who knows? Anyway, um, here we are. Here we are in our new year. It's 2021, and we're going to be continuing our journey forward in church history. And this year, we're going to be trying to get, or this next set of sessions, we're going to try and make our way through the medieval period to the Reformation. And so, as you saw in the opening title there, we're going to be starting with the medieval church. We have left the ancient church. We have left the ancient church in the past, and we are now moving forward to the medieval church. And we're going to see what's in store for us there. The medieval church is said to have begun basically in 476. So this is it's an arbitrary time point or time period in time to start something new. So history, like, cut and dry things. We as humans, we like cut and dry things. It's this, it's not that. It happened here and here. Gray areas are kind of a problem for us, but in history is full of gray areas. So when we look at the medieval church, the Middle Ages or the medieval period, the traditional thing is to say, well, the whole thing started in 476. Everything before 476 is ancient history. Everything after 476 is medieval history. And that's an arbitrary time frame, but it's a convenient one because it is in 476 that that the Western Roman Empire is traditionally held to have fallen apart. It just collapsed completely when the Ostrogothic king, a guy named Odoacer, invaded Italy, captured Rome, and declared himself to be king of Italy. He nominally recognized the overlordship of the Eastern Roman Emperor, but it just for ease, the Western Roman Empire is effectively gone. The emperor at the time is a young man named Romulus Augustulus, little Romulus and little Augustus, and he was neither, and he was thrown off the imperial throne and overthrown. Now, if you look in the history books, you'll see that he is not, in fact, the last emperor. Traditionally, he's seen as the last Roman emperor in the West, but he is not. And the guy who's technically the last emperor is a guy named Julius Nepos, who was elected emperor after Augustulus was overthrown, but he's really a non-entity. But the idea of the Roman Empire kind of goes on in the West for a long time. It'd be like if Canada or Confederation kind of started shattering and falling apart. It'd be difficult for us to give up the notion or to give up certain notions about the political situation as it exists. But effectively, in this period, what we see is the Roman administration going away, the Roman bureaucracy falling away. We see in the West, we see the imperial government essentially crumble and disintegrate, and it's replaced by a series of kingdoms, large kingdoms, small kingdoms, large principalities, small principalities, dukedoms, various warlords who now rule over certain areas. The Germanic tribes become a little bit more prominent at this time. The Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and all sorts of Goths become very prominent. It's interesting how much the Germans have impacted European history, actually, if you go back. But in any case, that's sort of where we are. So the Western Empire is kind of falling apart. And if you're a person living in the Western Empire, you are going to look at this and say, well, what's left? There's no imperial government. There's no imperial army. The political establishment or the political settlement that has existed from time immemorial, really, for over 400 years. Well, I mean, you could say over 1,000 years even, is gone. What do we do? And for a lot of people, it inspired a lot. It inspired a lot of feelings that the apocalypse was on them, particularly with the Germanic and the barbarian invasions that occurred at this time. These invasions were very violent. They were very bloody. They were not in any benign in any way. And so if you're a farmer or a peasant on the main road of one of these things, your farm is going to get torn up. Your stuff is going to get stolen. If you're a wealthy man, you might see your fortunes destroyed. And so people had to find a new way to live, and cities had to reorganize, and states had to reorganize to find a new way of doing politics and of governing each other and finding stability in this time of great unsettlement and of great there was great can't think of the word, great discord. Yeah, that might be it. Anyway, so that's the Western Empire. And in the Western Empire, there's one organization which survives the fall of the imperial government better than anything else, and that is the church. In fact, the church is the only organization from the imperial period that survives. And we're doing that a little bit more this time to keep my throat. Anyway, so the church is the only organization that has a pan-European presence, that it's present in many different areas of Europe. The Western Empire, largely gone, there is no presence. You have different kingdoms, different principalities now. It's not a uniform government. It's not a uniform country anymore. And so the church really provides a sense of safety and security for people and a sense of leadership, because they are the only institution that keeps on going. Mass continues. Priests continue to preach. The work of the church continues in this period in the West under the auspices of the Pope. And this is partially where we're going to see the Pope begin to gain a lot more prominence. The papacy, being the only sort of stable pan-European organization that exists, is going to gain for itself not only a lot of spiritual power, but a lot of temporal power. And this is where we'll start seeing popes making claims not only to spiritual authority, but the authority to make kings and emperors and to unmake them. And we're going to see a lot of battles between kings and emperors and popes and prelates. And we're going to see the battle between church and state play out quite a bit. So the Western Church is really the Western Church it's a united body under the leadership of the papacy, but the secular authority is divided all over the place. It's basically a great mosaic of different governments and princes. And the uniformity of language that exists in the church, it's Latin. The church language is Latin, and Latin is for a long time the lingua franca of Europe because of the church. The church is everywhere, and where is everywhere? It's Latin. It's Latin. The church speaks Latin everywhere. So if you go to church in Paris, or you go to church in London, or you go to church in Prague, or anywhere in the Western Europe, you go to church, you will hear Latin. It will always be the same. And that gives people a sense of stability. And in this period, we're going to see monasticism kind of take off and thrive as people seek stability and order. And people, at least in the early time, there's again a sense of the apocalypse happening. Christians are nothing if not creative in terms of determining the apocalypse. We're very good at seeing that coming. We're very good at predicting that coming. Every 20 years, there's a new Antichrist after every crisis, and the present age is not excluded. But in any case, we're not going to get into any of that. I just want you to know that the Western Empire is in a very difficult state at this time, and people are scared. Wealth has drained away. There's a lot more poor people. Farming is not as easy as it was. Technology that the empire had set up, aqueducts, baths, fountains, all these sorts of things are falling into disrepair because there's nobody to repair them. A lot of knowledge is being lost at this time too. Education is falling away. So the state of the Western Empire is really not very good, and we're going to see the papacy step in to fill the void of power And as the West recuperates and recovers itself and begins to rebuild itself under the leadership of emperors like Charlemagne and Otto, and try and, as it tries and fend off the threat of the Muslim invasions from Africa and from the East, we're going to see it reinvent itself. And we're going to see the political power dynamic between Pope and Emperor come to a head. And we're going to see it play out a little bit like it's never been played out before. So in any case, that's the Western Roman Empire at this time. Just going over my notes here. So what we're going to see in terms of the power of the Pope, we're going to look at a few popes. We're not going to look at all of them. But one of the really interesting ones we're going to look at in this time, we're going to look at Gregory the First, also known as Gregory the Great. He's the guy who kind of sets the tone for the papacy in the Middle Ages. He kind of transitions from the early church to medieval papacy. And then we're going to see Innocent III, Pope Innocent III in the 1200s. Innocent III is largely credited as being the pope who acquired the most power out of the medieval popes. He was the most powerful, the most influential pope. And so we're going to take a look at him and see what kind of power he wielded. We're also going to see the theology of the church begin to diverge from Augustine to Gregory, and we're going to see sort of the Augustinian idea of predestination and salvation be supplanted by more of what we as Protestants look at as superstition and unnecessary additions. But the magisterium, the authority of the church, becomes much more important in this time frame. The church is very much an institution of contrast at this point. Monks and clerics will be very influential in terms of education and politics. And parish priests, on the other hand, will see their education fall off. I mean, a lot of priests will be men who are unable to read or write even. They are, well, at least very well. They will preach sermons that have been pre-written or pre-memorized. They won't have much in the way of knowledge of the scriptures. And so what we see is a lot of superstition, a lot of folklore creep back into Christianity in this time. And that comes from an uneducated priesthood kind of going back to the old pagan knowledge of the place and combining it with Christianity to make, a faith that people identify with, so to speak. We're also going to take a look at the Crusades. I know you're all excited about the Crusades. Everybody wants to talk about the Crusades. That's the most exciting thing to happen in the Middle Ages, of course. There are 6 major Crusades. There are a few subsidiary ones from that. We're going to look at all of them, not all in the same kind of detail, because not all of them have the same impact, but certainly we're going to look at the First Crusade, the Second Crusade, the Third Crusade, on and on. And then we're going to look at the crusading zeal throughout Europe. What happened there, and why Crusades anyway? Why did they begin? Why do we see Christians picking up, leaving hearth and home, leaving their lands, kings and princes and nobles leaving their lands and their castles and their armies and their wealth and their riches to set out for some desolate, barren land far across the sea? In the time, the Holy Land at that time was known as Outremer, which is an old French word for beyond the sea. Outre, beyond, and then mer, meaning sea. So why did that happen? We're also going to look at Islam, at the rise of Islam. We're going to look at it in 2 sessions. One session will be myself. I'm going to look at it from a historical context. We're going to see where it began, how it spread, what it looked like, how far it got into Europe. You might be surprised. And how the Europeans interacted with the Muslims in the Middle Ages going forward. And then we're going to look at, and then I'm going to have a guest speaker. It's a guy you might know well. My good friend Michael Zwagstra has agreed to do a session on Islam itself. As we all know, Michael is not only a deputy mayor of the city of Steinbach and a city councilor, he is a teacher at Green Valley School here in Grunthal, and he developed the World Religions class, which is quite well known and quite well known, very popular class, which has been developed now for the provincial curriculum. And Michael will be giving us a session on the rise on Islam itself. What is Islam? What do they believe? What are the tenets of Islam. We as Christians need to understand this, because we typically don't see Muslims as the same as us, and they don't really see us as the same as them. Although historically, Muslim administrations have given Christians the status of being people of the book, so people who kind of associated. We're not on the line, the truth of Islam. We're kind of on the side here, but we have similar prophets. We have similar teachings in some cases. Although our concept of God is radically different. So we're going to have Michael Zwijkstra give us a session on that. Hopefully we're back in person at that time. So stick around for that. We haven't set down a date for that, but it will definitely happen. So it might happen out of sequence, depending on how we get schedules done, but it will happen during this time. So that's kind of where we're going. We're going to be looking at a few other things, of course. We're going to be looking at theologians, the big thinkers of the era. We're going to look at the proto-reformers. These are the guys who aren't reformers. We don't see, they're not Martin Luther or John Calvin. They're not in the Reformation era, but they came before the Reformation era and kind of, presaged it. They gave kind of a shadow of what was coming. Those are guys like John Huss and John Wycliffe. We'll look at the East-West split between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, the East-West split that happened in the 1000s. We will also look at we'll also look at some art and architecture of the Middle Ages. I think it's important that we look at this, because when you look at the great church buildings of Europe, a lot of them are medieval. They're Gothic cathedrals, and this is a style that came about. It succeeded the Romanesque style of architecture, and we'll look at that a little bit more. We'll look at some nice pictures of some beautiful buildings, and we'll look at some pictures and talk about what they mean and how we can interpret them. So that should be a lot of fun. Again, don't know when that one's going to come up. Maybe we'll save that for the end as kind of a treat. All right. So to get us started, we're going to go east. We're going to start in Constantinople in the Middle Ages. And we're going to start, now remember, at this point, the church in the East and the West are still seen as a single unit. They have different leadership structures, but there is an acknowledgement that they are brethren. They are united. They are the same Christians. They are Christians. They are fellow Christians. The Pope in Rome is recognized by the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Emperor is recognized by the Pope as being the Emperor. So there is unity here. And we're going to, even though there might be conflict between them and disagreements between them from time to time, there is a concept that they are a unified group. They're a unified family. We're going to start in the Middle Ages by looking at an emperor in the East who is pretty significant as far as emperors go. And this is a guy named Justinian. Justinian is an emperor, and he reigns from 527 to 565, so relatively long reign. In fact, I believe it is one of the longest, if not the longest, of the Eastern Roman emperors, although I'm not sure about that, so don't quote me on that. But Justinian is born in a place called Tauresium, which is in Macedonia. There's you can see it marked on the map there of modern-day Europe. And he is the son of a peasant family. He is not of an imperial heritage. This is something that is going to be common in the Byzantine era. We'll see emperors kind of as they rise and fall. We're going to see emperors rise from the military, from the peasantry, not necessarily always related to not necessarily always a member of the imperial family. So this isn't like our modern royal family. Our modern royal family, we can trace the royal family back to we can trace our royal family back quite a ways, all the way back to 1066 to the Conqueror, to William the Conqueror. And if you're interested in that, I love British history, and I've studied this since I was a little kid. So in any case, we will. But I'm getting out of my way here. But in any case, we're going to be looking at Justinian. So Justinian is a peasant. That's my point. He is a peasant. He is not a member of the imperial family. And his native tongue is not Greek, it's Latin. And this is significant because he's from the East. He's born in the East under the rule of the Byzantine administration. But his his heritage is from the West, obviously, and Greek is the lingua franca of the East, and it had been for a very long time. From Nero's time, Greek had kind of acquired an equal status with Latin in the Eastern Empire. And Latin is the language of the Western Empire, but Justinian speaks Latin better than he does Greek, although he does learn Greek. He speaks Latin generally better than he does Greek. As a boy, he's adopted by his maternal uncle, a guy named Justin. So for all you people named Justin, or for all you people who know people named Justin, it's a very ancient name. It's not just a cool name that was thought up in the 1980s. I had like 6 Justins in my class, and I doubt that any one of them was named after this guy. But in any case, Justinian had an uncle on his mother's side whose name was Justin, and Justin had a very important post. He was one of the emperor's bodyguards. Being a member of the imperial bodyguard is a significant position. It puts you right up close to the seat of power. And we know that looking at Roman history, imperial bodyguards have in the past affected politics in a very significant way. In the West, the Praetorian prefect, which was the guy who's the head of the Praetorian Guard, which was the bodyguard of the Western Roman emperors, he would often be involved in plots to assassinate the emperor, and he would try and become emperor himself. So this is kind of like the palace coups come from the Praetorian Guard. In the East, is a little bit different. The East have a different type of guard. They're called the Varangian Guard. I'm not sure if they're in. They may be around at this time, but the Varangian Guard are not Praetorians. And this is a side issue. This isn't going to come up in some test later on. But just as an interesting thing, the Varangian Guard is a bodyguard that was developed after the emperors decided that the Praetorians were no longer trustworthy. They needed people who were trustworthy. And so where did they go? Who are the best soldiers, the most loyal, the most trustworthy soldiers in Europe at this time? Vikings. What? Vikings? Yes, Vikings. Norsemen, as they are also called. This is where we get the term Normandy. Normandy was given to the Vikings to settle. That's where Normandy comes from. The Normans invaded England in 1066. Viking heritage there. And the Normans also invaded Sicily, southern Europe, and southern Italy, and they had a significant kingdom there. But the Vikings also spread into Russia, and they also came down and worked for the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. And in fact, if you go to the Church of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul today, you will find graffiti from a Varangian Guard etched into the balustrade of the second level. If you ever go there, check that out. He wrote his name in the balustrade. A Viking. So it's pretty cool. I have a picture of that. I don't think it's in this presentation, but if you're good, I might show it to you later on. In any case, sorry. So at this time, Justin is not Varangian. He's not a Viking. So this is before that guard is formed. But in any case, he's an imperial bodyguard. And Justin takes his nephew, Justinian, to Constantinople, and he educates him very well. He gives him a solid grounding in law and in education and theology, which are the topics that any well-educated young man needs to know at this time. And he then invites Justinian to join him in the emperor's bodyguard. When the emperor Anastasius dies, which was not an assassination, by the way, just so you know, he helps his uncle Justin become the new emperor. So Justin, being the head of the guard, is now well placed to become emperor. And Justin appoints Justinian as consul, which is a high civic office in the Roman Empire. And he also appoints him as commander of the army. And he becomes one of his uncle Justin's closest advisors and closest confidants. And in fact, Justin also appoints Justinian later on as a co-emperor. So Justin is sort of the senior emperor. Justinian is the guy who's going to be the heir. He's coming up. As Justin, who reigns for quite a long time, I think it was 14 or 16 years, something like that, he towards the end of his life, he starts becoming more senile. He has, I think, dementia. And so as he loses his mental faculties, Justinian begins to take on more responsibility. And when Justin dies in 527, Justinian takes over as the sole emperor. Now, Justinian is very energetic as an emperor. This is a guy who loves work. He loves work, and he's very good at it. He is a good administrator. He's known as being very genial. He's kind. He's generous, but he's also a ruthless politician, as all emperors are. A good politician is genial. He talks to people. Everybody likes him, but he can be ruthless and cutthroat if he has to. And certainly, Justinian was that way. His goal, kind of as emperor, was to reestablish the empire as a great power. The empire, of course, has shrunk since its height under Constantine, and Justinian is looking to reestablish the Roman Empire in its old imperial lands. So these are lands in the west that have since been lost to the imperial administration. But Justinian wants them back. He's a great builder and he's a patron of the arts. He sees himself equally as a Roman emperor, and if you'll remember, the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantines, never saw themselves as anything other than Romans. They referred to themselves as the Romans from time immemorial. They didn't see any difference, and even up to the fall in 1453, they always referred to themselves as Romans. Their emperor was the Roman emperor. He was descended from Augustus and from Constantine, and he was the successor of Augustus and Constantine, and he was the Roman emperor. And this was largely acknowledged by the Pope. The Pope in the West acknowledged, after the fall of the Western Empire, the Pope in the West acknowledged the Eastern Emperor as the sole Roman emperor for a time. And so this was something that it wasn't something that was challenged in any great way until we get to Charlemagne, we'll talk about a little bit later. So in any way, Justinian sees himself as equally a Roman emperor on the civic side, great leader, great builder, great patron of the arts, great administrator, great general, but he also sees himself as a Christian emperor. And his mission with the empire was to protect the church and enforce sound doctrine. That was his greatest goal, his greatest accomplishment. He felt as emperor, this was his mission, his reason for being on earth was to enforce sound doctrine and to protect the church. So Justinian, we'll talk about him a little bit as a builder. Emperors and kings and princes, they generally see building things as a way of augmenting their status, adding to their grandeur, showing how wealthy their kingdom is, showing off to outside ambassadors, that sort of thing, but show off power and wealth and technological achievement. And Justinian's buildings really did increase the prestige of the Eastern Church by giving it the most impressive church buildings in the world. And in fact, I would say that the buildings that Justinian built were not rivaled in the West probably until the great cathedrals were built, or I would even argue until St. Peter's Basilica was completed. Justinian's most famous creation is, of course, the Church of Holy Wisdom, otherwise known as the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. The church had the largest enclosed space in the ancient Roman world, and it also had the largest dome in the world until St. Peter's was built. So 1,000 years, it had the largest dome. It was the largest building basically in the Western world, or in the world, I guess you could even argue, for 1,000 years. That's impressive. The church, of course, of the Hagia Sophia, you can visit it today. But we'll look at a few pictures a little bit later. The construction of the Hagia Sophia, despite being so big and so impressive, it only took 5 years and 10 months to build, less than 6 years. And they did this because Justinian, one, was emperor, and two, he could get a lot of labor going really quickly, and three, he despoiled a lot of pagan temples to get the marble and materials for that church. A lot of the columns and the marbles hanging on the wall and even the doors to the Hagia Sophia were stolen from pagan temples and were reused there. It's a spectacular result, I have to say, for a hodgepodge building. And it was the largest church in the world until St. Peter's was completed. Lots of references to St. Peter's here because that's really the only church building you can compare to, frankly. The Hagia Sophia served as the center of Eastern Christianity and was the site of all Byzantine coronations until it fell to the Ottoman Empire in 1453. So this is a picture of the outside of the Hagia Sophia, and I took this when I was in Istanbul, when I had the opportunity to go to Istanbul. And you can see there that you can see the great dome, the great Byzantine dome, and it's got four minarets on it. And that's because when the Ottomans took over in 1453, they, of course, turned it into a mosque. They turned it into a great mosque. And the earliest minaret, I believe they added, was the one on the far right. That's the red one. I believe that's also the smallest one. And the other ones were added later on. Incidentally, if you are in Turkey and you see mosques that have two or more minarets, those are mosques that were set up by the emperor or the sultan, who is also called the emperor, or a member of his family. Those are called imperial mosques. If they have more than one minaret, they are known as imperial mosques. So that's just a side thing for you if you ever do visit Turkey, which I highly recommend you do. It's a fantastic place. The buildings in the foreground, in front of the cathedral, all those dome buildings that are in front of it, those are called, I believe those are called turbs. I'm mispronouncing that, I'm sure. But those are basically tombs. And I believe there's a school there as well, an old school where they taught like Islamic law. But those tombs are the tombs of certain Ottoman sultans, and their family are buried there. But the Church of the Hagia Sophia is that purple bit there, and it still stands today. Very impressive construction. And when it was finished, Justinian made the claim, Solomon, I have outdone thee, that's quite something if you think about the description of the temple in the Bible. But in any case, I mean, that's an impressive building no matter where you are, and it is as impressive today, I would say, as it was when it was built. Incidentally, this building served as a mosque or as a church from the time it was built in the time of Justinian until the fall of the Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire in 1453. And it was turned into a museum by the Turkish government in 1935, I believe, when Ataturk, who was the president of Turkey, decided to secularize Turkey and to make it more Western. And so he turned this building from a mosque into a museum. And when I was there, it was still classified as a museum. And you may have read recently that under President Erdogan in Turkey, he has redesignated this as a mosque, and so it is used as a mosque again today. There is a benefit to that in that you don't have to pay an entry fee now to go visit it. It is free, but they're still dealing with issues of how to cover up the imagery inside because, of course, Islam does not permit pictures of people in its mosques. That is not allowed in the Islamic religion. So in any case, that's kind of the situation with that as it is. And now we're going to take a look at a few pictures of the Hagia Sophia. So on the left-hand side there, that's sort of the entrance lobby when you come in. You see the great vaulted ceilings, the brick construction. This is all ancient Roman handiwork. You kind of get an idea here of what ancient Roman construction looked like and how grand it actually was. It was as grand and as bold and as beautiful as it's described. On the right-hand side is the narthex, so this is the point before entering the sanctuary, and you can see the marble panels on the wall. And again, these were mined, but also taken from pagan temples to decorate these walls. The ceiling is a mosaic, I believe, and it contains motifs of fish, which is like the fishers of men, the disciples, all that kind of stuff. And at the far end of that picture on the right-hand side, you'll see a door. You go through that door, up those steps, turn right, and you'll go up a ramp to the second level. If you ever go there, highly suggest you go to the Hagia Sophia. The lantern lights, the chandeliers are, of course, an Ottoman addition. It's a view of the ceiling, so you can kind of get a better idea of what the ceiling looks like. We're going to talk in the next session about iconoclasm, and we're going to deal with mosaics and iconoclasm, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why we see different symbols here. But you can see just the beautiful intricacy of the building and of the work done here. The picture on the right, this is the great imperial door. This is the big door. Only the emperor and the imperial family could enter the church through this door. I believe that door is made, it's either marble or alabaster. It's quite impressive, and no doubt taken from probably from a pagan temple, although it may not have been. There are other doors there that were pointed out as taken from pagan temples. But in any case, that's the Great Imperial Door. And this is the inside. And you can see what a spectacular building this would have been at the time. Just look at the size of the people compared to the enclosure of the space here. The Great Dome, when you look up at it straight up and the sun is shining through those windows, it looks like the dome is floating over the space. And that is what so many visitors were impressed by in this church, was that the dome appeared to float over the people. It was like a great celestial body. And you can see the all the marble in there, and the mosaics, all the holy images, the cherubim in the space just underneath the dome, appearing to hold it up. Just wonderful, wonderful architecture, just spectacular. And you can see the panels. The building contains, of course, at this point in time, it was a museum. So the medallions on the wall there, that's Islamic calligraphy, or Ottoman calligraphy, and it contains passages from the Quran. So it kind of emphasizes the dual nature that this was a church that was then turned into a mosque. But again, this is not like we typically think when you think of a Romanesque building, it's typically thick walls, little windows, very dark. But you can see how bright and light this is, and it must have been very impressive to people back in the day when it was built. There's a motif in here on the floor that is called an omphalion. This is the motif on the left-hand side in this picture. And this is a motif that you'll see in many medieval churches. If you've ever been to Westminster Abbey and you've been to the point of the great altar in Westminster Abbey, you'll see a motif similar to this. It's not the same, but it's similar. And it's a representation or a depiction of the celestial objects, of the sky. It's meant to represent sort of that ethereal celestial nature of God, that he is in the sky and all around us. And this is a common thing that you'll see in many medieval churches. And it's called an omphalion. And that big gray marble slab in the center, that is where Byzantine emperors were crowned. So that is where every Byzantine emperor after Justinian was crowned, on that spot. It's very cool. On the right-hand side is a view of the church, or of the Hagia Sophia's, sanctuary from the second level, from the gallery. And you in the right-hand side there, at the far end of the building, you can see the mihrab. That is the niche in the wall which indicates the direction to pray, and it generally faces Mecca. And you can see just on the center left of the screen, there appears to be a raised kind of pavilion that has a golden screen in it. And that was where the Ottoman sultans and their families prayed. So they were in the mosque, they were praying, but they were out of view from people. And in the Ottoman period, the Christian mosaics would have been plastered over. But there's been a great deal of time spent restoring them in the time that the modern government of Turkey has overseen this building. And the way that they're trying to deal with them now, when people are praying in this building, is to cover them up with either sheets or to use special lights to drown them out. And then they'll be visible when it's not prayer time. Very controversial decision, I think, on the part of the government of Turkey, but that's where it is. So be glad you don't have to pay the fee to get in anymore. Here we see a couple of mosaics. The Hagia Sophia is full of mosaics, and mosaics are a big part of Byzantine art. And these are all mosaics, little tiles, gold tiles, blue tiles, all little glass tiles that are used to tell stories and for emperors to connect themselves to the past, to tell stories about themselves, and to give the image and impression that they want of themselves. So in this first one on the left, you see a mosaic of Justinian. He's on the left, and he's carrying a model of the Hagia Sophia, and Constantine is on the right. And he has the city, of course, of Constantinople, and they are both presenting the church and the city to the Virgin Mary and Jesus, and essentially saying, we are the great emperors. Here's Constantine, founder of the city. I, Justinian, the equal of Constantine, the builder of this great church, and we are humble. We dedicate these things to God. These are not our things; they are God's things. They are His. Kind of interesting, but it's trying to again draw attention to the connection between the imperial to the monarch, or from the monarch to God, to make that connection clear. Because emperors, again, they claimed rule by divine right. On the mosaic on the right-hand side, this one is a little bit less well intact, but in the bottom right of the picture, you can see kind of what it would look like properly restored. It's Jesus, or it's the Virgin Mary and John the Baptist. They're surrounding Jesus, and they are praying to him to show mercy during the Last Judgment. And again, another example, we see Constantine the 11th on the left and the Empress Zoe on the right, presenting donations to Christ. And this probably represents all the money they spent on the restoration of the Hagia Sophia itself. You look at the numerals there, IC and XC beside Christ. Those are the initials of Christ in the Greek language, indicating who he is. Interestingly enough, with Roman emperors, the depiction of them with Byzantine emperors is very similar. You don't see a lot of distinction in terms of their face. But you can tell from the regalia and the crown that this is the emperor. You look at all the jewels and pearls on his coat. It's very interesting. And then again on the right, you see just a photograph of a portion of the architecture from the gallery above the main floor of the Hagia Sophia. So Justinian is a great builder, and he also built several other major churches, like the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna in Italy, and the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. It's unfortunate that the Church of the Holy Apostles didn't survive the Ottomans. I think by the time the Ottomans took over, the church was probably in disrepair. And rather than converting it into a mosque, they simply demolished it. But it was the place where all the emperors were buried. It was the imperial burial ground. It was kind of like Westminster Abbey is for the British monarchy. All the great kings are buried there. Justinian also builds a lot of secular stuff, including a series of cisterns to store water for Constantinople. And the most famous of these is the Basilica cistern, which very conveniently is located about a 5-minute walk away from Hagia Sophia if you're ever in Istanbul. And the picture on the right is kind of what it looks like. It's like a forest of columns underground. And this would have been, in its heyday, it would have been full halfway or almost to the top of water. But nowadays it's empty. It has a little bit of water in the bottom. But these are columns. There's a lot of despoiled pagan architecture here. And there's even one column is resting on a sideways head of Medusa that's kind of been thrown down as a foundation stone. So the pagan religion really continues to take a blow in Justinian's time. And under additional emperors, the Christian period is well and truly entrenched. So as a legislator, a lawgiver, Justinian was very prodigious. He undertook a massive reform of the Roman legal system. Laws and precedents in the Roman legal system had not been codified for centuries, and the law was very inconsistent and contradictory depending on where you were. And so Justinian decided to compile all these decisions and all these laws into a code, and it was called the Justinian Code. And it basically codified all the laws from the 2nd century onwards. And this also included a textbook on how to apply the law, as well as a collection of older Roman laws and commentaries from famous Roman lawmakers in the past. If you ever go to the legislature here in Manitoba, you will see in the chamber above the speaker's chair, you'll see a list of 5 great legislators. I believe it's, I'm going to forget them all here, but there's Manu from India, there's Justinian, I believe there's Napoleon, no, not Napoleon, I can't remember, Moses, I can't, anyway. Yeah, so anyway, the Justinian Code is mentioned in the Manitoba legislature in the artwork above the chamber. So go take a look at that if you'd like. It's quite interesting in and of itself. Justinian's code contained religious laws and it codified Chalcedonian Christianity. So this is the Christianity of that was approved of at the Council of Chalcedon in 491. This was the Nicene Creed being confirmed. All the sort of standard bedrocks of Christianity that were confirmed at Chalcedon are now codified as imperial law, not just church law, but imperial law in Justinian's code. Justinian also deprived non-Christians of citizenship, and he no longer recognized other Christian sects. So Christianity became, his goal was to make Christianity uniform and to make the faith described at Chalcedon the faith of the empire. The law required everybody in the empire to be Christian and to follow Christianity, and it forbade pagan practices, and it also served as a foundation of law in the West, and again is memorialized in the chamber of the Manitoba legislature. There's a lot of codes that kind of form a basis for Western law, but the Justinian Code is really one of the big ones, an attempt to sort of codify all these decisions and laws from the past and make something coherent out of it. Justinian's personal faith was of great importance to him, as we see that because he imposed it as emperor on everybody else. He he basically strengthened the church in the Eastern Empire, and his goal was to take non-Orthodox sects and basically get rid of them. And he began the process of establishing the principle of something that is known as Caesaropapism. Now, Caesaropapism is the principle that the head of state is also the head of the church, as opposed to a churchman like a bishop or a pope or a council. The emperor is above all of that. And in fact, the Second Council of Constantinople recognized that the emperor's approval was required before anything could be promulgated in the church. And Justinian had called this council to bring an end to Nestorianism, which, if you remember, well, I don't know if we discussed it previously, but anyway, it was the teaching that there are two separate persons in the incarnate Christ, one human, one divine. We talked a little bit about this in the early church heresy series. But Caesaropapism is a concept that was able to be maintained in the East. In the East, there was no question about the emperor's authority over the church, over the patriarch of Constantinople and other bishops. In the West, this never came down to anything. And in fact, it wasn't until Henry VIII in England when he was declared head of the church in England, that kind of Caesaropapism became a thing in the Western church. In the Western church, the Pope was always the head of the church, and there was never any question that the emperor was the head of the church, even though there was battles between them for power. The emperor never claimed that he was the head of the church, whereas in the East, it was clear from day one that the emperor was in charge, and challenging him was not good. So Caesaropapism, that's what it is. It's a concept very much in the East, not so much in the West. Justinian is a protector of the right of monks to inherit property and the right of annual gifts and the rights of annual gifts to the imperial from the imperial treasury to monasteries. So monasteries could take on property to further their economic health. And he also prohibited the confiscation of monastic property. So monasteries kind of get a boost from Justinian in this period. The monophysite heresy, which remember is the teaching that Jesus has one nature and that is divine, that the human is subsumed into the divine and is the divine nature that is important. The monophysite heresy was a scourge to Justinian. He hated it, and he worked hard to try and get rid of it by more harsh means than other emperors. Previous emperors had dealt with the monophysite schism in the church by being quite lenient towards them, trying, the carrot and the stick. And they had used a lot of carrots, and they hadn't really gotten anywhere. Previous emperors had even allowed, the appointment of monophysites to important church offices, and the papacy and the Western Church had kind of had enough of this, and so they broke with the Eastern Church. This isn't the Great Schism, by the way, we're not there yet. But the papacy and the Western Church kind of breaks with the Eastern Church, and they say, you really can't do this. These people are not Christians. They don't understand who Christ is or preach the true Christ. And they break with the Patriarch in Constantinople. So Justinian ends the tolerant policies towards the Monophysites, and he reestablishes relationship with Rome. So the church splits and comes together, and kind of splits and comes together. It's this organ, it's like an amoeba that can't quite detach itself from itself. Justinian also did something interesting in that he claimed the right, as emperor, to settle papal elections. So when disputes arose in who was the legitimate pope, he, as emperor, claimed the right to settle that election. And interestingly, that is a right that emperors will claim in the West when the imperial crown is reestablished in the West. Go figure. Who would have thought that emperors would like this power to decide disputes between people who should be the pope? But he did claim that. And, it's just another thing in this battle between pope and church. But it was how he saw himself in this idea of caesaropapism, that he is the head of the church. Justinian was not entirely successful in suppressing the Monophysites. In fact, he didn't. The teaching was quite popular in Egypt and in North Africa, and he eventually began to start alternating between compromising and persecuting them. And one of the great problems, of course, in this is his wife Theodora, who is a sympathizer with the monotheites, and that probably contributed to his waffling back and forth. Isn't that always the way, guys, you have a source, you have a path of action defined, you're ready to do it, and then your wife kind of comes in and says, I've got to think about this in a different way. So Justinian is also a conqueror, and like I said earlier, he is really bent on reconquering the West, getting those old imperial lands back under imperial authority. And he is largely successful through the efforts of his generals, two guys named Belisarius and Narses. And Belisarius was his general in Italy, and he was able to reestablish control of several huge portions of the Roman Empire, as you can see here. So in the dark orange, light red portion, you see the empire as it was under Justinian when he started, and then you see the in the yellow gold color, you see the territory he managed to reconquer. Certainly, he reconquered Italy, little parts of Spain, parts of North Africa. Not quite the old Roman Empire, but still a substantial amount. And this is the furthest the Roman Empire will get, or the Byzantine Empire will go. From here, territorially, it's all downhill. So controversy and scandal. What is an emperor without a little bit of scandal? Justinian's reign, during this time period, natural disasters really seemed to afflict the empire with a stunning scale and regularity. For example, in the mid-530s, a famine caused by a period of climactic cooling ravaged the empire. The famine affected Europe and the Middle East, and the cause is suspected. Nowadays, climatologists have suspected that the cause was a series of violent volcanic eruptions happening in quick succession in different parts of the world. So in the Ring of Fire in the Pacific, and also in Europe, there were probably some big volcanoes that went off closer to Europe that caused sort of this temporary cooling and this famine to break out. And then again, in 542, there was an outbreak of plague that struck the empire. And we're not sure how many people it killed. We know it was a lot. It could potentially have been millions, but in any case, it was quite devastating to a lot of people. And we're familiar with pandemics now. We're living in one, not as bad as this, of course. Our pandemic is a little bit different from the plague pandemic, but of course, pandemic's pandemic. It's times of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. When is this going to end? When we're going to come out of it? What are we going to look like when it's over? The estimates have the number of deaths in Constantinople reaching at about 5,000 a day at the height of the crisis. And the plague pandemic stayed around until about the 8th century. So the plague broke out in 542 and it stayed till the 700s. So basically what happened is it cycled. So it got bad, and then it would get better, and then it would get bad, and then it would get better, and it would get bad and get better. And that's how that pandemic cycled. And plague pandemics became a regular thing in Europe going forward. So I don't know how that bears on us going forward. Hopefully it doesn't presage us. But in any case, that plague pandemic lasts for a good 200-300 years. In 551, a massive earthquake hit the area around Beirut. This is in modern Lebanon. And it measured about 7.5 on the Richter scale and was felt as far away as Alexandria and Antioch. So that's a big, big earthquake. And it triggered a tsunami that extended along the coast of the Middle East from Tyre to Tripoli. And medieval sources say that the water withdrew about 2 miles away from shore in some cases. So imagine, you're on the shore and then the water goes out for 2 miles. That's a big tsunami. And the death toll was estimated around 30,000. So troubling times in the early Middle Ages. You have natural disasters and sicknesses taking, doing their work in the East. You have the government falling apart in violence and war and bloodshed in the West. It's just a really difficult time. So you can kind of understand why the apocalyptic, why the outlook for so many people was very apocalyptic at this time. The great controversy of Justinian's reign is the Nika riots. And in 532, Justinian was 4.5 years into his reign, and he's not very popular. He had introduced some new taxes, and he had appointed unpopular officials over the city of Constantinople. And these officials were seen by the populace as being corrupt and greedy, and that's never a good thing for people to see these officials as corrupt and greedy. That's never a good thing for the king because it makes him look bad. Justinian's reforms to the civil service had also alienated a lot of nobles. So basically what had happened was he had decided to clean up the civil service, to get rid of all the fraud and the bribery and corruption going on. And that threatened a lot of very lucrative jobs for a lot of very rich people. In fact, if you're a corrupt civil servant, you can take bribes and all this kind of stuff and make a lot of money. And for the nobles who filled those jobs, that was a very lucrative source of income if they didn't have a lot of land or stuff like that. And a lot of noble families also felt that Justinian didn't favor them, that he didn't favor the aristocracy, that he was more concerned about the popular approbation of people. And so that stoked further unrest. Now, Constantinople and the Eastern Empire, and this might surprise you, but it might not, was divided into 4 associations, I think is right to call them. The Reds, the Blues, the Whites, and the Greens. This sounds like a clue game going on here. Mr. Red killed Mr. Blue in a white drawing room with the green hammer. Not quite. But in any case, there were 4 major associations, and these associations are like political parties, but they're not just political parties. They are theological parties. They are sports groups. So imagine fans of the Winnipeg. So let's imagine you're a fan of the Winnipeg Jets. And as a fan, and fans of the Winnipeg Jets they're Jets fans, they're Bomber fans, they're also Calvinistic Christians, they are also supporters of the Conservative Party, and they are opposed to wealthy businessmen and aristocrats, and they are for low taxes. So you can see the level of integration that this had in society, that these things were. It wasn't just a political association, it was a whole lifestyle thing. And the largest of these 2 groups were the Blues and the Greens. Just on the right-hand side here, this is a diagram of the Great Palace of Constantinople over here. And the Hippodrome of Constantinople was here. This is where the races happen. So all the great chariot races. The chariot races were the sport that everybody was into. It's like soccer in South America or Europe. It was du jour. Everybody was into it. This area, by the way, in modern times, this is covered over here by the Blue Mosque. Hagia Sophia is over here. Hagia Irene is over here. That's an older church. It's older than Hagia Sophia. And it's now in what is known as the Topkapi Palace, which was built by the Ottoman Sultans. But in any case, the Great Palace of Constantinople no longer exists. The Hippodrome is gone. And in this area is the Blue Mosque. So if you're trying to figure out where we are in Istanbul, that's where we are. Um, anyway, back to the Nika riots. So the largest of these groups are the Blues and the Greens. And these associations, again, wide-ranging. They not only held similar support for sports teams, various sports teams, but they also were partisan in terms of their political views, the theological viewpoints, and imperial succession. They supported different candidates for the imperial throne at different times. They were part street gang, part political party, part social club. It's a very interesting thing to study. In fact, they were so influential that the imperial government had difficulty controlling the city without either at least the Blues or the Greens on their side. The Reds and the Whites are not big. They're either associated with either the Blues or the Greens. They're kind of like subgroups. And in 531, basically, they caused a massive riot. In 531, the Blues and the Greens, some Blues and Greens are arrested for murder in connection with rioting that happened after a chariot race. And this was a fairly common occurrence, if you can imagine. Hooliganism was not an invention of soccer, of European soccer. It, in fact, it was something that existed long before that. Some of these accused murderers managed to escape, and they managed to take sanctuary in a church. The Emperor Justinian was in the middle of peace negotiations with the Persian Empire at the time, and he attempted to defuse this situation by not executing the murderers, but rather sentencing them to life in prison. He didn't want trouble in the city. He had a lot of things going on with the Persians, so why would he want trouble in the city? So let's try and get everybody on side here. I won't execute these guys, but I'll throw them in prison for life. We can all agree that that's the proper course of action here. But their supporters demand a full pardon, and so this is a problem. Now, the emperor's unpopularity, the emperor's unpopularity with certain groups, his popularity with other groups, his civil service reforms, his tax reforms, his choice of government officials, it all made him very unpopular with the Greens. And the emperor was, in fact, the supporter of the Blues. Ooh, yes, the emperor was a Blue. The Greens were Monophysite supporters. So here again, theology coming up, very important in the debate in the Eastern Roman Empire, in a political debate in the Eastern Roman Empire. The Greens were Monophysites. They had a lot of aristocrats in their group as well, people who, again, Justinian is not popular with. The emperor is a supporter of the Blues, and on January 13th, 532, things come to a head. So on that day, races are being held in the Hippodrome, and the crowd of the Hippodrome is largely hostile to the emperor, and they had been yelling and taunting and yelling insults at him the whole day. The emperor had a box that was directly connected from the palace to the Hippodrome. The Hippodrome was kind of like the great public square. If the emperor wanted to know how people were feeling, all he had to do was go to the Hippodrome. They would either cheer him or boo him. It was kind of this great democratic thing, although I wouldn't call, he's an autocratic emperor, so you have to kind of be careful. So the crowd had been kind of yelling insults at him the whole day. And at the end of the day, each side stopped cheering for their respective teams and started chanting Nika, 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 which is the Greek for victory. And for the next 5 days, Constantinople was ravaged by riots, and the great palace of Constantinople, the emperor's own residence, was under siege. And in fact, the Hagia Sophia, the second iteration of it, was destroyed. So the Hagia Sophia that's there now is the third Hagia Sophia. The first one was built by Constantine. I believe that one burned down, or he destroyed it and then built a new one. There's still pieces of it. If you go to Hagia Sophia today, you can see pieces of the old Hagia Sophia, but it's gone. Anyway, the second iteration of the Hagia Sophia was destroyed in this riot. So this is really, really big. And the mob, along with opponents of the emperor from the Senate, declared the late emperor Anastasius' nephew, a guy named Hypatius, the new emperor. So remember, Anastasius is the guy who employed Justin and Justinian as bodyguards. And then Justin took over from him. Justinian took over from Justin. And so now there's a bunch of senators and aristocrats who are saying, and the mob, saying that Hypatius, the nephew of Anastasius, is the new emperor. And Justinian's authority was very, very quickly ebbing away. And he decided that he was not going to stay and fight. He was going to flee across the Sea of Marmara. But, as is so often the case in these times, his wife comes to the rescue and says, "What are you thinking? What are you thinking? You are the emperor." She says to him, "Man up, don't flee. It is better to die in the purple," that is the purple robes of the emperor, to die in these imperial robes, than to live in ignominy and anonymity and in hiding as a peasant farmer. And she declared that there would be no time in her life from that point forward that she would not be saluted as the empress. Alive or dead, she was the empress. And so he got his backbone. Men, how often have your wives given you the backbone that you need to get things done, get you back up there? Behind every powerful man, there's an equally powerful woman. I guess that's true. And the emperor gets his backbone together, and he calls together his great generals, Belisarius and Mundus, and his eunuch Narcissus, who's again another general. And he is determined to get his power back from this rampaging mob. So they're going to try and fix this situation. So Narcissus is sent into the Hippodrome, which is the center of all these riots, the headquarters of the riots, if you will. And this is a very deadly place for an imperial official tied to Justinian to go. Everybody there seemingly hates Justinian. Why wouldn't they want to kill this guy? And Narcissus goes into the Hippodrome, and he approaches the leaders of the Blues. Remember, the Blues are the group who the emperor supported. He was a Blue. And he reminds them, the emperor is one of your supporters. And that Hypatius, a usurper, he's a Green. How can you support this guy? How can you fight in his favor? And then he also gives them a lot of imperial gold. He gives them just a huge wad of money. Now, during Hypatius's coronation in the Hippodrome, which was happening that same day, the Blues, after discussing the great arguments put to them by Narcissus, decide to pick up and leave. They're out of here. They're out of this riot. It's done. And the Greens are stunned as the Blues are leaving. You have to remember that half your crowd is getting out of here. Like, what's going on, you guys? And as the Blues leave, imperial troops flood the Hippodrome, not with water, but they enter the Hippodrome. Imperial troops enter the Hippodrome, and they kill every single rioter left. And it didn't matter if you were a Blue and you were stuck in the Hippodrome, you got killed. So Blues, Greens, Reds, Whites, didn't matter. Anybody left in the Hippodrome after the Blues had left is killed. And the death toll is around 30,000. So that is huge. That's a huge statement by Justinian. This is my authority. I am willing to slaughter 30,000 people to maintain my imperial authority, my imperial God-given authority. I will not be cowed. And this essentially restores Justinian's authority, and he's able to pursue his building plans and his policy agenda and his theological agenda without significant opposition going forward. And so that's one of the biggest things in his reign to happen to him. So the Emperor Justinian, he sought to bring unity to the Eastern Christian Church by enforcing the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. Goodness. Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. We'll look at that a little bit later. It's basically the Nicene Creed. Not only as a matter of convention or church policy, but also as law. He persecuted some Christian sects while trying to compromise with others. And in his dealings with the Monophysites, he was influenced by his wife Theodora, who was sympathetic to them, and that led him to be sympathetic to them when he might otherwise not have been. Justinian was a great builder. He built massive new churches in the empire, the crowning jewel of which is the Hagia Sophia. He enhanced the status, or he rather reduced the status of non-Christians by declaring that they could not be citizens of the empire, and he used his power to protect the church's property and to give special rights to ecclesiastical groups like priests and monasteries. He initiated the Byzantine doctrine of Caesaropapism, which means that the head of state, the king or the emperor, is also the supreme earthly head of the church. And this idea continues to grow as the empire goes on. The Patriarch of Constantinople will gradually lose a lot of power and influence as time goes on. And this idea is later adopted in Imperial Russia by the Tsars, who, after the fall of Constantinople, claim the mantle of being the new emperors. They take on the title Tsar because they are the Orthodox. They are the only Orthodox, the major Orthodox power remaining. The rest of Europe being Catholic, and so they claim to be the third Rome. We'll talk a little about that. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. So that brings us to the conclusion of our talk today. We talked about the Emperor Justinian, and I wanted to talk about him to set him up as a contrast to what's going to happen in the West. When we talk about the West, we're going to be talking about a very different situation politically and theologically. And we're going to be setting up, whereas here Justinian is not subject really to any authority. He's not battling with churchmen over what he's doing. What's going to happen is we're going to see the Pope and the Emperor in the West battle each other for authority. So I think, so Justinian, great builder, great emperor, ruthless politician. And next week, we're going to look at the iconoclasm controversy. Again, that's an Eastern church thing that didn't really spill into the West at all until the Reformation. And we're going to be also looking very briefly at the filioque clause or the filioque controversy. We're going to get those out of the way. And then after that, I hope to kind of tackle the Western Empire or the Western Europe and the Western Church a little bit more. As we move on throughout the Middle Ages, we're going to see, I'm going to reduce the emphasis on the Eastern Church and start talking about the Western Church a little bit more because it's more directly related to us. The Eastern Church doesn't advance theologically much like the Western Church, particularly as we get to the Reformation. The debates in the Western Church surrounding the authority of the Pope, the nature of salvation, the nature of God, are not really had in the East. And so the East is going to kind of fall away. And in particular in 1453, once Constantinople falls, we're going to see it. We're going to shift to the West entirely. So that was Justinian. If you have any questions on him or questions about what we've discussed today, please do email me and let me know. I'm aware that the province will be talking about ongoing restrictions come Friday. So we'll see what the new restrictions look like. As you can see, I need a haircut. I will be happy if the restrictions allow me to have a haircut. I would really very much like that. I don't want my hair to get long enough that I have to wear it in a top knot. I don't think people would appreciate that. In any case, that's it. So yeah, if you have any questions, just let me know. And otherwise, we will see you next Tuesday.